and thanks to everybody here for being here, and to everybody else who's watching on YouTube world. I should begin as the kind of cliche from historians. This is not my period, and this is thoughts which are really accumulated as background in something I'm writing, which is about the social psychology of class, of the labouring classes, working classes and peasantry of Britain and Ireland in the period of industrialisation, or indeed deindustrialisation, as you had in Ireland at the time. So this is background to it, but I think it's raised, for me, interesting questions. It's useful to kick off by defining bourgeois revolution, and I want to define it in terms of minimum programme, partly because it's useful, partly because I know CPGB is thinking about this at the minute. So what is a minimum programme for a bourgeois revolution? It's not a totally ramified working out social system, but a state restructuring that subordinates its coordinates to the accumulation of capital. In effect, this means subordinating the state to the social moulding imposed by the bourgeoisie. And the molecular process by which that is done is really fiscal discipline, the tax state. If you look back at the tax state of the ancient world, Rome in particular, relied upon the taxation of very sharply defined classes. That is, you're taxed as an aristocrat, or you're taxed as a peasant, or you're taxed as an artisan, in money or in kind. And in fact, to stabilize that, you couldn't move out of your class, nor could your children. So this led to a rigid social immobility, and indeed the wealthy would increasingly try and escape from it altogether, a significant reason for the collapse of the Roman Imperium. If we divide state sovereignty up between nobles, who basically run their patch of land, we have feudalism. If the state is centralized around a royal court, exercising its will through a standing army, we have absolutism. If the state relies for its income upon circuits of capital, the taxation of traded goods, whether material, labour or profits, or it relies upon national debt, or most likely in combination, then we have a capitalist state. It's a capitalist state because the state cannot kill the goose which lays the golden egg. It relies upon the fundamental health of capitalism for its own existence as a tax state. Now, if you look at early modern mercantilism and colonialism, what Marx called primitive accumulation of capital, we see a kind of transitional form. With mercantilism, trade finances the state, and it gives the state an interest, certainly, in the health of merchant capital. But fundamentally, the state controls the commanding heights of the mercantilist economy. And the state is able to subordinate merchant capitalists to its own interests. And it tends to block generalizing of market relations as destabilizing the state's ability to hand out monopolies to its favored merchants. In some respects, actually, mercantilism in this form had something in common with the tax state of the ancient world. Mercantilist subordination to the state is very unstable and easily leads back to aristocratic rules. This is essentially what happened to the northern Italian city-states, such as Venice in the early modern period. Now, the bourgeois interest is not to sweep away mercantilism necessarily. Bourgeoisie did very well out of mercantilism well into the first half of the 19th century, and again in the interwar period of the 20th century. The bourgeoisie is not naturally a free trading class, which should be actually a kind of auto-critique of my own earlier book on bourgeois liberty and the politics of fear. Rather, the bourgeois interest is to have a state which is, if you like, imbricated in the circuits of capital all the way down, not just a matter of the state handing out royal warrants for trade to its favoured merchants, but the state being dependent upon the health of market manufacturing and agriculture. This was a slow but ultimately certain process. The 19th century, 1848 revolution has really been a turning point. The fiscal state across Europe relied upon consensual taxation authorised by parliaments and relied upon national debts. When you get to this situation, even if parliaments are entirely neutered, the process has gone so far that the state remains subordinate to essential bourgeois interests. That is, the golden goose of the capitalist economy cannot be killed for fear of no more golden eggs. So if mercantilism is, if you like, a kind of state management of the commanding heights of the economy, it's easily turned against general bourgeois interests. What's required for a bourgeois revolution is a state reliance upon domestic production rather than foreign trade. Foreign trade, after all, can very easily be turned off, as it was for the Italian city-states when the New World was discovered, new routes to the New World, new routes to the West Indies, and the Ottoman Empire seized southeastern Europe. In that situation, the states of the Italian city-states simply reverted to something like feudalism. They were not imbricated in domestic production relations. So there needs to be a state reliance on domestic production for bourgeois revolution. And in the early modern world, this is almost always meaning peasant production controlled by the aristocracy. And the aristocracy is not a bourgeois class. They're essentially a politically rather than economically constituted class. Bourgeois hegemony over the state is essentially what I call inertial. It relies upon inertia. It's simply a condition of existence for the state. If the state relies upon domestic market production, then the state is, if you like, captured by bourgeois interests, without the bourgeoisie really having to do very much more. For the early modern state, foreign trade was by far the easiest to tax. The basis of the Tudor Stuart economy in England was woolen production for export to Northern Europe, where it got worked up. And a good way behind this, the provisioning of trade with the colonies in the New World. Now, provisioning and wool production was domestic manufacturing. The other important element of trade, which the state was able to tax, was a trade with the East Indies and with Russia. This was not based in Britain, and it effectively bolstered the non-bourgeois dimensions of the Tudor and Stuart state. Now let's have a look at the English Revolution itself. It began in 1639 to 40 as an aristocratic revolt, led by aristocrats seeking to clip the wings of the monarch. In this, it was much like other early modern aristocratic revolts, like the almost contemporary Fronde Civil War in France, unusual only in that it was more successful. In England, however, it radicalized when a large chunk of the aristocracy thought that pressure on the crown was going too far, was destabilizing the legitimacy of a society based upon rank in general, and a big chunk of the aristocracy went over to the king. Therefore, from August 1642, you have civil war, to some respects beginning as a civil war within the aristocracy. In the course of the conflict, the army became the major power on the anti-royalist side, eclipsing Parliament altogether. Charles I dragged out and resumed the war, and consequently came to be considered in biblical terms as a man of blood, and his head was chopped off in 1649. The subsequent Republican regime had a pretty narrow social and political basis, and there was general rejoicing when it collapsed on the death of Oliver Cromwell and the monarchy was restored. The aristocracy, which had a bit of a rough time in the civil wars, was also restored in pretty much full pomp. And again, in the Glorious Revolution, it was the aristocracy which asserted parliamentary rights against the crown. This time they avoided civil war and revolutionary escalation by inviting the stadtholder of Holland, William, to take the crown. After a couple of decades of quite a lot of instability, the Rage Party as it's known, a new dynasty was consolidated, the Hanoverian dynasty, and from 1714, and the Whig oligarchy was in pretty effective control. The elite political nation was firmly aristocratic, living in country houses on massive landed estates. Actually, the 1711 Land Property Qualification Act actually formally excluded merchants, financiers, and industrialists from Parliament. It is never rigorously enforced, but it wasn't actually repealed until well into the 19th century. Merchants, in fact, were powerful and ensured a rigorously mercantilist and expansionist, colonialist, and economic orientation of the state. So aristocrats in control, why was this a bourgeois dispensation? Broadly speaking, because the rule of law protected property and exchange at all levels, and this was guaranteed by the legislative and fiscal supremacy of Parliament. Okay. Now, Marxists, of course, have tended to see the English Civil Wars as the key stage of all of this. This was the bourgeois revolution. But in that case, who were the bourgeoisie? Well, anything like an industrial bourgeoisie was almost entirely lacking. The northern city-states actually had quite substantial factories. England, not really. Christopher Hill has really looked to the gentry as a stand-in, but the gentry were really a subset of the aristocracy. They were not really a putative bourgeoisie. They followed the aristocracy, divided politically with them. If anything, they were more royalist than the nobles. And anyway, they're not a convincing bourgeoisie. They were constituted as a political class. They were little involved in production in a nitty-gritty way, which they more or less left to the farmers. Robert Brenner has looked to the capitalist merchants, but they make a pretty poor revolutionary vanguard. It's important to remember the role of the merchants was in actual production was extremely limited. They were intermediaries between the manufacturers, who are largely artisan, and their markets. Often benefiting from government-granted monopolies and always anxious for a respectability denied them by their nouveau riche reputation, the merchants tended to cling to the grandeur of royal personage. Rich merchant was far more likely to be royalist than parliamentarian. Brian Manning, another Marxist historian, has looked to the middling sorts, as they were known at the time, not really a bourgeoisie in Manning's view, but an artisanate in the process of differentiating between a bourgeoisie on the one hand and a proletariat on the other. The middling people, the middling sorts for Brian Manning, were basically a kind of fairly soggy mess, which was a proletarian in the egg and the bourgeoisie in the egg, rather than being a defined class itself. So far as Brian Manning were concluded, they drove the radicalism of the revolution, but it's not clear why such a stratum would have bourgeois class interests, and if you define middling sorts in the broad term, largely speaking, they didn't. Now, it's certainly true that the middling sort crowd played a key role in the revolution. The London apprentices rose repeatedly, and it was when the House of Commons mobilised the London crowd as its defence against the royalist coup d'etat in late 1642 that the aristocracy, which until this point had been pretty solidly parliamentarian, broke, and a large section of them went royalist. They didn't like the crowd being mobilised. The wealthier bourgeoisie of London, however, were politically inconsistent at best. As Hobbes pointed out in his history of the conflict, rich subjects that have made themselves so by craft and trade were men who never look upon anything but their present profit, and who, to everything not lying in their way, are in a manner blind. In essence, they're not a very political class. Indeed, by 1647, the citizens of London and the victorious new model army were at loggerheads. Workers of London, understandably pissed off at Puritan killjoy Sabbatarianism, rose in unsuccessful but pretty serious revolt in April 1648. And nowhere was enthusiasm for the return of the king greater in 1660 than it was in London. So we come to the yeoman. Yeomen, we'll come back to the definition, but basically strong farmers, kulaks if you like. Well into the 19th century, historians are pretty unanimous in seeing the yeomanry as the key radical force in England's history, the foundation of England's liberties and powers. And indeed, that famous picture you'll have seen of John Bull is basically an idealization of the yeoman, well fed on beef, proud, self-sufficient, pretty fat. Most historians of the 19th century were equally convinced, however, that the yeomanry had been destroyed by the agricultural enclosures of the 18th century. Their small farms had been taken off them, had become the property of aristocrats. The Christian socialist historian R.H. Tawney pushed this dispossession of the yeomanry when he was writing in the early 20th century, way back to the 16th century, the period of the earliest enclosures. Tawney held these enclosures as responsible for destroying the yeomanry to the benefit of the gentry. And it's really from Tawney that we get this idea of the gentry making the English Revolution, the gentry becoming the stand-in for the bourgeoisie in a way which I think is, as I've indicated, is very problematic. The gentry were a subset of the aristocracy. They weren't the subset of the bourgeoisie. When Tawney wrote, this generated the famous, in historiographical circles, storm over the gentry, a debate about whether the gentry were actually rising in social power in the early 17th century, or whether they were in fact falling in social power. Still runs on a bit, this debate, but probably they're actually falling in social power, if anything. Christopher Hill noticed the yeoman, but was inclined to dismiss him as being pretty unimportant. Brian Manning, as I've suggested, took more notice, but folded the yeomanry into the middling sorts. Yes, they drove revolutionary radicalism. They generated things like the leveller movement, the diggers and all that kind of thing, the Shakers and all the rest, and Fifth Millennium men. But ultimately, they failed to put their stamp on the revolution. They were the radicals, but the bourgeois revolution of the English Civil War was not their revolution. In a fairly recent defense of the Marxist interpretation of the English Civil War, James Holston's Ehud's dagger, class struggle in the English Revolution, the yeomanry are basically absent. They don't feature really in the text. They're completely absent from the index. Neil Davidson, in his recent general study of bourgeois revolution, has basically posited a bourgeois revolution without a bourgeois, a consequentialist interpretation, meaning that a concatenation of more or less accidental events had the accidental consequence of a state and society propitious to capitalist development. I'm not very happy with this defining bourgeois revolution as something which is bourgeois because it creates capitalism. It's not really a bourgeois revolution then, is it? A bourgeoisie is a class. To be a bourgeois revolution, a class has to do something, which is a bourgeoisie. It should leave us feeling uncomfortable, I think, as in many respects, a consequentialist interpretation of the bourgeois revolution is not that different from Tory history. Davidson, perhaps unsurprisingly in light of this, is a big fan of Norman Stone, who was an outright reactionary historian of the 1970s, 1980s, pegged it in the early 21st century, I think. I want to propose that a revolutionary bourgeoisie can be identified. It's not the merchants, it's certainly not the gentry, and it's not just a tendency within a broadly defined middling sort. It's in fact fully developed as a class itself at the time. It's the yeomanry. Now, the yeoman pops up a lot in the records of the period, but so far as I know, only one book for the period has been dedicated to them. And this is an old book. It's Mildred Campbell's 1942, The English Yeoman under Elizabeth and early Stuarts. Mildred Campbell, an American historian. It's a very good book, and in fact, if you read anything about yeomanry, she always pops up because no one's done a book which succeeds it since then, and I'm not volunteering to do so. Who were the yeomen? I would say that they were not a disappearing class or a marginal class. as Tawney and others would suggest. They were, in fact, the bulwark of the emergent bourgeoisie. Yeomanry were the substantial farmers of England. Now, in reputational terms, they had risen to prominence as the famous soldiers who repeatedly broke the military power of the armoured knights of France in the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt in the 100 Years' War. They famously wielded the longbow. The longbow was a kind of cross between the AK-47 and the Stinger missile that was able to take out a knight on horseback. As a class, therefore, the yeomanry had long been part of the English social scene. During the era of Tudor and Stuart inflation, when labourers, smallholders, and gentry often struggled economically, they prospered. They were average buyers and sellers and leasers of land. They benefited from the trickle-down effect of the dissolution of the monasteries. The gentry got the monasteries, ultimately, because of inflation, ran out of money, flogged on land to the yeomen. And they benefited from the sale of crown lands. Again, the crown trying to raise money with flogging land. They benefited. Tawney says they suffered from enclosure. They didn't. They did well out of enclosure in the 16th century, 16th and 17th century. They benefited from the reclamation and enclosure of forest, waste, and fenland. It's important to note that an equivalent class, it was remarked at the time, could not be found on the continent. They were well recognised, to quote Thomas Fuller, as an estate of people almost peculiar to England. The yeoman was also referred to as the Oaken Man, the man of oak. He is the Oaken Man because he is rooted in the soil. So unlike the rich merchants of London that Hobbes said was kind of apolitical or at best purely opportunistic about its politics, whatever made profit at the time is fine with them. The yeomen were quite different. They were rooted in the land. They owned land, which was the social basis of political power in the early modern society. They were therefore a political class in the way the urban bourgeoisie were just not. While the gentry were the ruling class at the level of the shire, the yeomanry provided the personnel of government at its most basic level, the country parish. They ran the administration, they were the administration of religion as church wardens, of police as constables, of poor law as overseers, and of public infrastructure as surveyors of highways and bridge wardens. The juries, which operated how law and much more than law, they operated the affairs of the village towns. The juries were composed almost exclusively of yeomen because the gentry couldn't be bothered with the responsibility. And even in terms of national duty, those yeomen who owned their own property, the 40-shilling freeholders, participated in the election of knights to the shire, to the House of Commons. The yeomen also were liable to enrolment in the trained bands of militia. I'd say that the yeomanry were an agricultural bourgeois class. They lived in well-built homes, black and white timbered dwelling, those nice Tudor houses you see, which have got kind of white plaster and black timber running through them. They're yeoman houses. As far as Chester, that's what a yeoman house looked like. If you go north of Chester, the houses were made out of grey stone. These are solid houses. The yeomen, smaller yeomen, kept shops, alehouses, and inns, as well as their farms. The larger yeomen, shading into the lesser gentry, invested in coal, iron, and clothing industries. But unlike the gentry, they were hands-on. They managed their own employees. They often worked with them. When times are hard for the gentry, the yeomen, as was said at the time, entered into the trade of usury, buying of cloths and purchasing and merchandises, climbing up daily to the degree of gentleman, and so doing, bringing up their children accordingly. So they did well when the gentry were not doing well. They didn't, however, adopt the social psychology of the gentry. Being working farmers, they could always assure their own subsistence and pursue market opportunities precisely by sparing themselves the expenses of gentle living. They were not conspicuous consumers. The gentry, as a kind of politically constituted class, absolutely relied upon conspicuous consumption in order to cut a dash at court. The yeomanry, as Mildred Campbell defined them, was a land-hungry, profit-hungry, and profit-conscious class. Does that ring a bell? They must be differentiated from the gentry, who retained much of the psychology of a feudal class, sustaining their position primarily through the exercise of patrimonial power, even if they had a rentier interest in capitalist agriculture. It was, after all, the mark of gentry status to, as I said at the time, to live idly and to spend freely. The psychology of the yeoman was quite different, focused not on conspicuous consumption, but profitable investment. And it was the religious and political inclinations of the yeoman who set the tone of local communities. Now, they're by no means entirely Puritan or entirely parliamentarian for that. But there's no doubt that the core of parliamentarianism and religious Puritanism was yeoman. Puritan Protestantism suited the social psychology of the discipline, thrift, and unostentatious pursuit of profit. Richard Baxter, the famous Puritan writer, who himself was of yeoman stock, in his advice captured well the concordance of the Protestant and bourgeois ethic. He said, "If God show you a way in which you may lawfully get more than another way, without wrong to your soul or to any other, if you refuse this and choose the less painful way, you cross one of the ends of your calling, and you refuse to be God's steward and to accept his gifts and to use for him when he requireth it. You may labour to be rich for God, though not for the flesh and sin." This is very yeoman. You labour to be rich for God, but you're not spending it in an ostentatious way, the way the gentry do. Now, it is precisely in defence of their specific class identity that the yeomanry became revolutionary, I think, about the 1620s. In 1626, Charles I, newly ascended to the throne and fallen out with his gentry and aristocratic parliament, turned to the yeomanry at first as a potential class basis for a quasi-absolutist regime. He actually had an idea of kind of having a yeoman parliament and to try and get them to agree to taxation. This didn't work out, but he squeezed the yeomanry for taxes and subsidies when the aristocracy and gentry refused to pony up. Sir John Savile, speaking in the House of Commons in 1626, told how the yeoman copyholder languished and decayed because he had to bear, as he put it, 3 parts out of 4 in the subsidy books, that is 3 parts out of 4 of domestic taxation. And indeed, in 1629, the cash-strapped king raised about £100,000, a lot of money, by compounding with those yeomen who had neglected to receive the expensive honour of knighthood. The point being here, he said, if you get to a certain point of wealth, you're supposed to become a knight. Becoming a knight makes you gentry. Becoming gentry means you're not allowed to involve, you're not expected to involve in manufacturing or hands-on agriculture, husbandry anymore. Instead, you're expected to become a minor aristocracy, a class constituted politically, who hangs around the courts and runs the shire. So basically, by threatening the self-conscious yeomanry with having to become knights, the yeomanry say, we're not doing that. We want to continue running our farms, running our manufacturing. So instead, they have to pay compensation to the crown for not becoming knights. They do so, but with ill grace, and the yeomanry felt scalped and looked upon the crown from here on in with the deepest suspicion, as Charles I numbly observed. Now, when we get to the English Civil Wars, and we look at the classic 19th century study of English Civil Wars by Gardner, Gardner observed how the social divisions of the Civil War period followed those of religion. And Gardner wrote, Social antagonisms were already prepared to embitter the religious conflict of English civil wars. The greater part of the nobility and the gentry of England were inclined to look with contempt and loathing upon the claims of yeomen and handicraftsmen to throw off the yoke of authority, whilst the yeomen and handicraftsmen were well pleased to vindicate their independence against the upper classes on the grounds of theology, in which they imagined themselves to be masters. So, if you like, the Puritanism of the yeomanry was both functional for their class existence, but also a mark of class pride. And indeed, there was a marked tendency for the yeomen of the countryside and the meddling groups in town and industrial areas to side with Parliament, and a much less marked tendency for merchant oligarchs and aristocrats to side with the Crown. The chaplain to the Gloucester garrison, or parliamentary garrison, John Corbett, wrote in 1647 on the social composition of parliamentary support, and I quote from him here. On the side of Parliament, there is no excessive number of powerful gentry, but the inhabitants supporting Parliament, consistent chiefly of yeomen, farmers, petty freeholders, and such as use manufacturers that enrich the country and pass through the hands of a multitude, that is capitalist commerce. A generation of men truly laborious, jealous of their properties, whose principal aim is liberty and plenty. Such, therefore, continually thwart the intentions of royalist tyranny. The countryman had of his own and did not live by the breath of his great landlord. Neither were the poor and needy at the will of the gentry. Why? Because the poor and the needy observed those men by whom those manufactures were maintained, primarily the yeomanry, and that kept the poor and needy alive. Now, if you look at the English Civil War, the weakness of the parliamentary army in its first years was primarily in its cavalry, which was easily outclassed by the horse of the royalist forces. Aristocracy are good on horses. It was Cromwell's key initiative to build his own cavalry, and ultimately the new model army had as its core the cavalry made up of Puritan freeholders and farmers of the eastern counties. These are the famous yeoman troopers who won the war, of whom Cromwell said, "I would rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than what you call a gentleman and is nothing else." Now, the yeoman revolution of the 1640s had its social consummation. If you remember from the 1640s, the attempt of the Crown to impose knights' service upon the yeomanry, that is to force the yeomanry to take up a knightly tenure, which essentially turns such a class into what you might call a feudal class which is no longer primarily involved in the management of agricultural production and rural manufacture, but instead is a class which is constituted and, if you like, forced to be a political class focused around the court. Now, in February 1646, wardship, which is what this knightly tenure was known as, and all burdens connected with feudal tenures and land were entirely abolished by a resolution of the Long Parliament, that is the Revolutionary Parliament. Tenures by knight service simply ceased to exist. This was put into statute form in 1656, and it survived the Restoration. This statute was reenacted at the time of the Restoration. Now, this is often misunderstood. Surely knightly tenure only affected the gentry. But as I've indicated, knightly tenure was a threat to the class composition, was a threat to the class interests of the yeomanry. And in fact, the way land is all commingled in England meant that knightly tenure actually already riddled and complicated yeoman land holdings too. As Lombard observed in 1656, because nothing is more inconstant than the estate that we have in lands and living, the tenures of gentry and yeomen have been so indifferently mixed and confounded in the hands of each sort that there is not now any note of difference to be gathered by them. Together with the vindication of common law juries, which we will remember were primarily yeoman juries, to determine land titles and customs, and the taking over of equity from the quasi-absolutist Star Chamber by the Court of Exchequer in 1641. This amounted, as Christopher Brooks, the legal historian, has written, to, quote, something like a social revolution in which patriarchal and seigneurial landlord-tenant relationships had been replaced by economic ones, and where a class of smaller holders, the yeomen, existed alongside the gentry and vigorously exercised their rights. And this ability to hold and to exercise rights, both formal and legal, but also informal and social, were really important in composing that inertial social pressure which constrained the state in England and made the state essentially a bourgeois state. Now, the yeomanry have been overlooked as a social driver of the English Revolution for the good yet paradoxical reason that they seemed to disappear in the decades following the English Civil Wars. Already around the time of the Glorious Revolution, 1688, that lusty, honourable race styled the yeomanry of England could be spoken of as in the past tense. This was misleading, however. What is happening is that owner-occupiers working their own farms with assistance from servants were being displaced, or better, being converted into tenant farmers. Tenant farmers who provided the capital to pay and run for working farm properties, which they rented or hired from the landlords. The yeomanry were not disappearing, but coming out more clearly, if gradually, as unadulterated capitalist farmers. They owned capital which they used to rent working farms in order to realize a profit. They were, if you like, disengaging from a simple permanent ownership and management of a farm, which ties you down, and instead becoming true capitalist investors. You invest into rent, you invest into wages, you invest into improvement, you run a farm for a profit. When you've got your profit, you either rent again or you move your profit on somewhere else. Nothing more capitalist. Now, to an extent, the yeomen seemed to disappear in the decades of the Restoration because the Restoration social order were indeed seeking to demobilize them as a revolutionary threat. In 1671, a statute was passed that prevented landholders worth less than £100 freehold or £150 leasehold from hunting even on their own land, while the gentry could still chase it across their land as they liked. This is obviously because the gentry liked hunting more than they liked managing production, but actually it's also a way of demobilizing the military capability of the yeomanry. Hunting is great experience for learning your military arts, which is one reason why Frederick Engels was a great enthusiast for hunting himself. He loved doing it. Now, this didn't destroy yeoman military potential at one fell stroke, but it is noticeable that those who turned out for Modernized rebellion in 1685, an anti-royalist rebellion, broadly speaking, also known as the Pitchfork Rebellion, it's notable that the yeomanry who turned out for that were mounted on rather diminutive horses. They were losing that military capacity, which to a large extent relied upon having hunting steeds, good in the hunting field, good in the military field. The yeomanry of New England, used to wielding weapons and game hunting from childhood, were a far more formidable prospect when they took up arms against the crown in the 18th century American Revolution than their disarmed American counterparts could ever hope to be. The yeomanry, to a large extent, were disarmed, as were the popular classes in England, generally speaking. But there's no question that the yeomanry continued as an important political class at the national level in the decades following the Restoration of 1660. All is thrown its weight against the pretensions of the crown. They were, as I have said, the betrayed bulwark of Modernized rebellion. They swung in behind the Glorious Revolution. And in the early 18th century, the yeomanry were no pushovers for the landed aristocracy. As Sir W. Ryder complained in 1715, The farmers in the country seem to be generally mighty sort of grumbling people that are never contented but always complaining. They are a sort of ungrateful and tractable sort of people. The more you oblige them, the more imposing they are, and the more kind, the less careful they are to pay their rent. They especially impose upon the landlords that live a distance from them and are ignorant of the forms of husbandry. Poor gentry, poor landlords. So politically, it kind of looks like the aristocracy and the gentry run the shop in 18th century England, but the inertial power of the yeomanry is massive. They are a class which cannot be pushed around. Politically and socially, the yeomanry were the fundamental class in the 18th century. They could not be ignored by the aristocracy, and in this, they were unique in Europe. And on this point, I quote Adam Smith. In England, he said, the security of the tenant is equal to that of the proprietor. There is, I believe, nowhere in Europe, except in England, any instance of the tenant building upon the land on which he had no lease, simply trusting it, simply renting it. He doesn't have a long-term lease on it. And this tenant been able to trust that the owner of his landlord would take no advantage of so important an improvement. Those laws and customs, so favourable to the yeomanry, have perhaps contributed more to the present grandeur of England than all their boasted regulations of commerce taken together. The yeomanry, said Adam Smith, was more important than mercantilism. I think this is true. If you want a comparison, look at Ireland, where it's the tenant farmer in Ireland. If he made any improvements, precisely had those improvements taken off him in terms of higher rent by the landlords. In Ireland, there was no yeomanry able to accumulate capital. In England, it was the very foundation of agriculture. And we must remember that agriculture was the basis of manufacturing until the Industrial Revolution. The economic historian Bob Allen has shown that it was not the aristocracy, but the yeomanry who well into the 18th century were in the vanguard of the agricultural revolution, massively raising agricultural productivity. It is from this secure position that the yeomanry modernized into a more a contemporary version of the middle classes. As farmers, they became capitalists employing labourers, renting rather than owning their land. Owning your land is sinking capital, so you can't use it. Renting the land is keeping your capital as liquid as possible. And they no longer had to engage in manual labour, as the yeomanry of the revolutionary period had tended to do. And indeed, it's from the yeomen that came many of the first generation of manufacturers that started and led the Industrial Revolution. This comes through clearly, not so clearly in subsequent books, it comes through very clearly in this book, Paul Mantoux' History of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Mantoux writes, in the industrial districts, the yeomanry had no need to move. Until the middle of the 18th century, Oldham, for example, was surrounded by farms which the free holders, the yeomanry, occupied and worked. 50 years later, the same families were at the head of the town's chief manufacturers. The Lees, the Broadbents, the Hiltons, the Taylors, family names, who had become spinners, and the Boltons, Joneses, who were working the coal mines, were all yeomen or the sons of yeomen. The yeomanry provide the first generation of the industrial bourgeoisie. Now, of course, no doubt it's a minority of the yeomanry who broadly defined at any rate, who transitioned to becoming successful industrialists. But broadly speaking, the yeoman bourgeoisie of the Civil War era did manage to recompose as the classic English middle class of Regency and Victorian England. They had made their revolution. So I just want to conclude with some broad points, moving a little bit away from the bourgeois revolution and indeed England, partly to come back to the minimum programme and some intractable concerns which bother me about the socialist minimum programme. As I have said, the bourgeoisie are essentially a class of inertia, an inertial class holding the state to close account through the discipline of the fiscal system, through the state's imprecation with domestic production, which is controlled by bourgeois class interests. The minimum program, if you like, of the bourgeoisie is that the state will do whatever is required to make the minimum program of the bourgeoisie is whatever is required to make the state dependent on the health of the capitalist economy. Constitutionally, this means a parliamentary system. Fiscally, it means taxation of commerce, domestic commerce, wealth. It also means the national debt. In maturity, one can dispense with the parliamentarianism. And this, I think, is the fundamental problem with the socialist minimum program. Now, the socialist minimum program comes from two springs. First, the demands thrown up spontaneously by the workers' movement. Second, the minimum conditions under which socialists will form a government. Now, these are minimum conditions because they don't amount to a realization of socialism overnight. Indeed, the realization of socialism, if it is to avoid trauma and probable economic and social collapse, is a more or less protracted process. The minimum program is minimum in that, as Marx said, hopefully, but I think not very convincingly, of the Paris Commune, because they provide the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labour. That is, the minimum program gives you sufficient control of the state, that you don't have the state working against you, that the power of the bourgeoisie is neutered, and therefore you can work out a more or less long-term process of the socialization of the means of production in a democratic form and in a fairly orderly form. The problem is that the demands that arise spontaneously from the workers' movement tend, if anything, to rivet bourgeois control. Progressive taxation, all as part of the demand of the minimum program, what does it do? It shifts the burden to wealth and profit. It shifts the burden of taxation to wealth and profit in order to pay for reform. But this in turn increases the backstop strength of the bourgeoisie. As the state becomes more dependent on the stability of capitalist production, and indeed becomes dependent on the preservation and enrichment of the bourgeoisie, in order to pay for progressive taxation, in order to pay for social reform, the state becomes more and not less reliant upon the circuits of capitalist reproduction. If you make the taxation so despotic as an inroad into bourgeois property, as the Communist Manifesto had recommended, then it tends very quickly towards wholesale expropriation. But precisely because it's tending towards wholesale expropriation, you have pell-mell social collapse, and what arises out of that is not an orderly socialist democracy, but an autocratic state arising above the mess. This is essentially what happens in Russia. Lenin's first thought is state capitalism. Effectively, you maintain capitalism within under the control of a proletarian state. Naturally enough, the bourgeoisie aren't too happy about this. They rebel. State capitalism turns into war communism. The attempt to restore some kind of order turns into new economic policy. This in turn is unstable, however, and what eventually emerges and tends to emerge in similar circumstances is the state rising above society in the form of Stalinism. The problem as it stands with the minimum program is that it either sustains capitalism, having no internal dynamic, or it escalates into a maximal program without having a social and economic basis to sustain it. And the state ultimately seeks to ground itself once again in re-established bourgeois social relations, the capitalist restoration. The missing element, therefore, is what precisely you find in the bourgeois revolution. The missing element in the socialist revolution is a convincing minimalist program of socialist constitutionalism, which subordinates both the state and the wealthy to the discipline of a workers' government. I'll leave it there.